Before the pyramids of Egypt existed, before writing was invented, before the first civilizations emerged, the world was a radically different place. We were not alone. We shared this planet with at least 20 different species of humans, each adapted to its own niche, each with its own evolutionary history. Robust Neanderthals dominated the icy lands of Europe. Mysterious Denisovans roamed the vast expanses of Asia. Small Homo floresiensis inhabited remote islands in Indonesia, and somewhere in Africa, a relatively unimpressive species called Homo sapiens began its own journey, unaware that it would eventually become the sole survivor of this rich human diversity. The question that has obsessed scientists for decades is simple yet profound. Why us? We were not the strongest. That is indisputable. Neanderthals surpassed us in pure physical strength, capable of bringing down prey with thrusting spears that required dangerously close approaches to deadly animals. We were not the first to explore the world. Homo erectus had colonized vast territories long before our species even existed, dispersing from Africa to the confines of Asia. We did not have the largest brains. Some extinct species possessed brains that equaled or surpassed ours in volume. So, what was special about us? For more than a century, paleontologists have excavated dusty caves and arid deserts, unearthing bone fragments that tell stories from millions of years ago. They have reconstructed ancient skulls, analyzed stone tools worn by time, and extracted DNA from fossilized remains that survived thousands of generations. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but the complete picture remains elusive. What we know for certain is that our survival was not guaranteed. There were times in our evolutionary history when we came perilously close to extinction, reduced to populations so small that we nearly vanished forever. We survived not by divine design nor inherent superiority, but by a complex combination of adaptations, cultural decisions, and, undoubtedly, a good dose of luck. But before we delve further into this fascinating story, let me ask you something. If this journey through our evolutionary past intrigues you as much as it does me, consider subscribing to Datoterra. Here, we explore the great mysteries that define our existence, from the origins of humanity to the most remote confines of the cosmos. Every week, we bring content that challenges what we think we know about our place in the universe. And speaking of places, tell me in the comments where you are watching us from right now. I am fascinated to know that this community extends across the entire planet, connecting curious minds from different corners of the world. The story of extinct human species is not just a tale of disappearances and losses, it is also our own history, because we, modern humans, are not a separate creation from the rest. We are the last chapter of an evolutionary saga that began more than 7 million years ago in the African savannas. Every extinct species was an experiment of nature, a different solution to the fundamental challenge of surviving in a changing and frequently hostile world. Some of these solutions worked for millions of years, proving to be incredibly successful by evolutionary standards. Others barely lasted a few 100,000 years before fading into the darkness of time. But all of them, without exception, contributed in some way to what we are today. When we speak of 20 human species, we are not resorting to hyperbole or dramatic exaggeration. Paleontologists have identified and documented at least that number of distinct hominins that walked upright on two legs and manufactured tools. Some are familiar names that appear in documentaries and textbooks. The Neanderthals with their sophisticated culture, Homo erectus with its extraordinary evolutionary longevity. Others are more recent discoveries that are just beginning to reveal their secrets to the scientific world. Homo naledi, found in the labyrinthine depths of a South African cave. Homo luzonensis, discovered in the remote Philippines just a few years ago. Every new finding rewrites part of our understanding and transforms human evolution into something much richer, more complex, and more fascinating than we ever imagined. The truly astonishing thing, what truly captures the imagination, is that many of these species did not live in epochs separated by millions of years. They coexisted in the same temporal period, sharing the planet as distant neighbors or direct competitors. Approximately 60,000 years ago, when groups of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa in more substantial migratory waves, they encountered a world already densely populated by other types of humans. In Europe, Neanderthals had established complex cultures for hundreds of thousands of years, dominating territories from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ural Mountains. In Central and East Asia, the enigmatic Denisovans occupied vast territories that we are just beginning to map. On remote islands in Southeast Asia, dwarf species like Homo floresiensis had brilliantly adapted to unique island environments with limited resources. These encounters between different human species were not rare events isolated in time and space. Thanks to revolutionary advances in molecular genetics, we now know that there were frequent interbreedings between these species. Current humans of European and Asian descent carry between 1 and 4% of Neanderthal DNA running through our veins. Populations in Melanesia, Australia, and some Pacific islands carry significant fragments of Denisovan DNA. This means something profound. Our ancestors not only occasionally encountered these other species during migrations, but they established relationships intimate enough to mate, have hybrid children, and those children survived, thrived, and passed on genes to future generations. In a very real sense, Neanderthals and Denisovans never completely disappeared. Fragments of them continue to live within us, influencing our immune system, our metabolism, even our physical appearance. But if there was successful hybridization, if we shared genes and could have fertile offspring, why do we consider Neanderthals and Denisovans as separate species instead of simply variants of the same species? The answer lies in the profound anatomical differences, the specific evolutionary adaptations, and the millions of years of independent evolution that separated them from us. Although they were biologically similar enough to reproduce with occasional success, these species had developed distinctive characteristics that made them unique and identifiable. Neanderthals possessed longer and more robust skulls, extraordinarily muscular bodies, and specific adaptations for surviving the extreme cold of the European ice ages. Denisovans, although we frustratingly know little about their complete anatomy, had specialized genes that allowed them to survive and thrive at altitudes where oxygen is dangerously scarce. The extinction of these species did not occur in a single catastrophic event. There was no apocalypse that wiped them off the map overnight. It was a gradual process, almost imperceptible to those who lived it, which painfully spanned tens of thousands of years. Homo erectus, which had been the most successful and long-lasting human species ever known, surviving an astonishing almost 2 million years, finally went extinct just about 50,000 years ago. Neanderthals disappeared approximately 40,000 years ago, although isolated populations in remote refuges might have persisted a few thousand years longer. The last Denisovans probably went extinct about 30,000 years ago, leaving only genetic ghosts of their existence. With each extinction, the world became a little less diverse, a little emptier, a little more solitary for our species, which continued to expand. Theories about the causes of these extinctions are varied, intensely debated, and often profoundly controversial among scientists. Some researchers suggest that Homo sapiens was directly responsible, aggressively competing for limited resources, systematically displacing other species from their traditional territories, or even engaging in violent conflicts. Others point to dramatic climate changes that radically altered ecosystems, eliminated food sources, and transformed familiar landscapes into inhospitable territories. There are those who propose that infectious diseases transmitted by Homo sapiens, against which other species had no immunological defenses, decimated entire populations. The truth, as is often the case in nature, probably includes elements of all these theories interacting in complex ways. What makes this story particularly humbling is that our own species was on the very brink of extinction on multiple occasions throughout its history. Approximately 70,000 years ago, a catastrophic volcanic eruption in what is today Indonesia, specifically the Toba supervolcano, caused a volcanic winter that lasted for years and possibly decades. Global temperatures dropped dramatically. Food sources collapsed in a cascade. The world human population was reduced to perhaps only a few thousand surviving individuals desperately clinging to existence. We survived by fortuitous combinations of circumstances, by being in the right places at the right time, and by possessing sufficient cognitive and cultural flexibility to adapt when other species, equally intelligent and capable, simply could not. That catastrophic genetic bottleneck is still clearly visible in our DNA today, a reminder etched in our genes of how close we came to joining our cousins in extinction. So, as we traverse this epic history of extinct species and improbable survival, keep in mind that it could easily have been us who disappeared without a trace. There is absolutely nothing inevitable about our presence here. We were not chosen by any cosmic destiny, nor designed by supernatural forces to dominate the planet, simply by an extraordinary combination of specific biological adaptations, astute cultural innovations, broad social networks, and yes, a considerable amount of pure blind luck. We managed to navigate the countless challenges that eliminated all of our evolutionary cousins. Understanding exactly how and why is to understand something fundamental about what it truly means to be human. It is looking directly into the relentless mirror of extinction and recognizing that our presence here is both an extraordinary privilege and a constant reminder of our profound fragility as a species. To truly understand why we are the sole surviving human species, we must go much further back in time than most imagine. We must travel to a period when the first ancestors of all humans were just beginning to separate evolutionarily from other primates. Approximately 7 million years ago, somewhere lost in the ancient African savannas, an evolutionary divergence occurred that would forever change the course of life on Earth. A particular primate lineage began to walk differently, to use its hands for different purposes, to develop slightly larger and more complex brains. These were the first steps, both literally and metaphorically, toward what would eventually become humanity as we know it. The first members of our family tree did not look much like us at all. Sahelanthropus chadensis, one of the oldest and most controversial candidates for a human ancestor, lived between 6 and 7 million years ago in what is now Chad. It had a brain roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee, barely 350 cubic centimeters of cranial volume. However, the position of the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal column connects, strongly suggests that it walked upright at least part of the time. This ability to walk on two legs, technically known as bipedalism, was perhaps the most defining and revolutionary characteristic of our evolutionary lineage. It freed our hands to manipulate objects, carry food, and eventually manufacture tools, fundamentally changing how we interacted with the world around us. After Sahelanthropus, the human evolutionary tree began to branch in increasingly complex and intricate ways. Ororhintugenensis appeared on the scenes of Kenya about 6 million years ago, leaving femurs that show clear adaptations for bipedalism. Ardipithecus ramidus walked through the African forests 4.4 million years ago, exhibiting a fascinating blend of primitive and advanced characteristics. Each of these species represented a different evolutionary experiment, nature testing different combinations of features to see what worked best in changing environments. Some had long, curved arms adapted for climbing trees easily, but legs and pelvis capable of walking upright on the ground. Others showed teeth and jaws that suggested particular diets adapted to specific foods. Evolution does not follow a pre-established master plan, nor does it have a predetermined direction toward perfection. It simply tests infinite variations, and those that work best in a given environment tend to survive and reproduce more successfully. Approximately 4 million years ago, a particularly important and diverse group emerged, the Australopithecus. These completely bipedal hominins rapidly diversified into multiple species across East and South Africa, adapting to slightly different ecological niches. Australopithecus afarensis, eternally famous for the partial skeleton nicknamed Lucy, found in Ethiopia, walked completely upright 3.2 million years ago. Its brain was still relatively small, around 450 cubic centimeters, but its long legs and wide pelvis were clearly adapted for walking long distances efficiently. It lived at a crucial time of climatic transition, when dense African forests were gradually giving way to more open savannas. This dramatic transformation of the landscape would have strongly favored individuals capable of walking efficiently across open spaces, crossing great distances between resource patches, and detecting predators from afar. But the Australopithecus were not the only hominins populating Africa during that remote period. They shared the continent with other fascinating evolutionary branches, some of which took radically different paths of adaptation. The Paranthropus, for example, developed highly specialized characteristics to exploit a particular diet of hard and fibrous foods. They had massive and powerful jaws, enormous molar teeth with exceptionally thick enamel, and prominent sagittal crests on the top of their skulls to anchor extraordinarily powerful chewing muscles. These extreme adaptations turned them into perfect biological machines for tirelessly chewing hard plants, underground roots, tough seeds, and fibrous tubers. 3 distinct species of Paranthropus coexisted in different regions of the African continent for more than 1 million years, demonstrating that their evolutionary strategy was viable and successful. However, their extreme specialization was probably both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness when conditions changed. Approximately 2.8 million years ago, something completely revolutionary appeared in the African fossil record: the first, deliberately manufactured, stone tools. These primitive tools, technically classified as Oldowan technology, were relatively simple from our modern perspective, consisting of stones strategically struck against others to create sharp, cutting edges. But they represented an absolutely monumental cognitive leap in the history of life on Earth. They required pre-planning, deep understanding of the physical properties of different materials, and the mental capacity to imagine a final shape before beginning the creation process. For decades, it was firmly believed that only the genus Homo manufactured tools, but more recent discoveries provocatively suggest that some Australopithecus might also have possessed this capacity. Tools changed absolutely everything. They allowed access to new, previously inaccessible food sources, particularly nutritious meat and fat-rich bone marrow, which provided much greater caloric densities than plant foods. Consistent access to diets richer in high-quality nutrients probably facilitated and catalyzed the next great, dramatic evolutionary leap, the development of significantly larger and more complex brains. Approximately 2.4 million years ago, Homo habilis appeared in the landscapes of East Africa, considered by many scientists to be the first official member of our genus Homo. Its brain measured between 600 and 700 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than that of any previous Australopithecus. Its hands showed specific anatomical adaptations for precise and controlled manipulation of small objects, with more developed opposable thumbs. It lived in mosaic environments that alternated between scattered forests and open grasslands, exploiting resources from both habitats. Homo habilis represents a fundamental turning point in our history, the crucial moment when flexible intelligence and systematic tool manufacturing began to drive human evolution as forcefully as purely physical adaptations. But the evolutionary tree did not stop or simplify with Homo habilis. Almost simultaneously, about 2.3 million years ago, Homo rudolfensis appeared, a similar but distinctive species with an even larger brain and a remarkably flatter and less protruding face. For decades, paleontologists hotly debated whether these two forms were truly distinct species or simply variations within the same species with high variability. This debate perfectly illustrates a fundamental challenge inherent in paleontology, defining where one species ends and another begins when we only have scattered fragments of bones separated by thousands or even millions of years. Nature does not create perfectly neat and defined categories. Evolution is fundamentally gradual and continuous, and species blur into one another across enormous temporal scales that defy our intuitive understanding. Then came Homo erectus approximately 1.9 million years ago, and with this extraordinary species began a completely new era in human history. This species was truly revolutionary in multiple fundamental aspects. It had brains that reached up to 1,000 cubic centimeters, tall and slender bodies, specifically adapted for walking and running long distances in warm environments, and developed a significantly more sophisticated tool technology known as the Acheulean industry. The characteristic bifacial hand axes of Homo erectus show careful symmetry and detailed planning, requiring hundreds of precise blows to complete. But the most truly impressive and momentous thing was its tireless spirit of travel. Homo erectus was the first hominin to successfully leave Africa and colonize other continents. Identifiable fossils of this species have been found in Georgia, China, Indonesia, and Java, demonstrating that they colonized a truly astonishing variety of radically different environments. The global expansion of Homo erectus marked the definitive beginning of human history as a truly worldwide phenomenon. We were no longer confined exclusively to a single continent of origin. Different populations settled in geographically separated regions inevitably began to adapt to specific local environmental conditions, laying the evolutionary foundations for the extraordinary diversity of human species that would follow. In Asia, some populations gradually evolved into more robust, cold-adapted forms. In Africa, other lines continued to develop in different and divergent evolutionary directions. The human family tree became increasingly branched, complex, and interconnected in ways that we are just beginning to fully understand. For more than 1 million consecutive years, Homo erectus was indisputably the dominant and most successful human species on the entire planet, demonstrating an absolutely extraordinary capacity for survival, adaptation, and persistence. Meanwhile, back on the African continent, the relentless machinery of evolution did not stop or slow down. Approximately 800,000 years ago, species began to appear that showed characteristics clearly transitional between the archaic Homo erectus and anatomically more modern forms. Homo heidelbergensis, with its large brain of approximately 1,300 cubic centimeters and robust muscular build, successfully dispersed across both Africa and Europe. Some scientists firmly consider it to have been the direct common ancestor of both the Neanderthals that would evolve in Europe and the Homo sapiens that would emerge in Africa. Others propose more complicated phylogenetic trees with multiple additional intermediate species. The frustrating but fascinating reality is that the more we learn and discover, the more intricate and complex the complete picture of our evolution becomes. In Europe, established hominin populations gradually began to specifically adapt to the cold and dramatically changing climate of the Ice Ages. About 400,000 years ago, the first true Neanderthals, or their immediate direct evolutionary ancestors, emerged. In Africa, populations continued to evolve in parallel toward increasingly gracile forms, with progressively larger brains and flatter, more retracted faces. 300,000 years ago, the oldest known fossils that clearly and unequivocally belong to anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared in Morocco. Our species did not suddenly emerge from nowhere as a completely new and unprecedented creation. It evolved gradually and inexorably from previous species, accumulating subtle anatomical changes and expanded cognitive capacities over hundreds of thousands of years of selective pressures. By the crucial moment, when modern humans were completely established as a distinctive form about 200,000 years ago, the entire world was populated by a truly rich diversity of coexisting human species. In Europe, Neanderthals were continuously perfecting their extraordinary adaptation to extreme glacial cold. In various regions of Asia, relict populations of Homo erectus still stubbornly persisted in some refuge areas. The enigmatic Denisovans occupied extensive territories in the vast interior of Asia. In Africa, alongside the emerging Homo sapiens, there might have existed other additional archaic species, of which we are just beginning to find tantalizing fragmentary evidence. It was a historical moment of absolute maximum human diversity, an extraordinarily plural world that will never exist again. And yet, in just a relatively brief 100,000 years, all that rich diversity would disappear almost completely, leaving us as the only solitary surviving branch of an evolutionary tree that was once incredibly leafy, diverse, and full of experimental life. Human evolution never followed a single, linear, and predictable path toward ever taller bodies or progressively larger brains. Instead, it produced a truly astonishing diversity of body forms, extreme sizes, and specialized adaptations that defy our expectations. Some human species became robust and muscular giants, perfectly designed by natural selection to survive in freezing climates and hunt dangerous megafauna. Others evolved into extraordinarily diminutive forms, brilliantly adapted to life on remote islands with severely limited resources. This extreme diversity shows us forcefully that there is no single ideal or superior body design for being human. Evolution simply relentlessly favors what works best in each particular environment and historical moment, regardless of how strange, unexpected, or counterintuitive the final result may seem. Let us begin by exploring one of the most surprising and revolutionary discoveries of the last 2 decades: Homo floresiensis. This extraordinary species was found on the remote island of Flores, Indonesia, and lived until just about 50,000 years ago, temporarily coexisting with modern humans. Fully developed adults of this species measured approximately 1 meter in height and weighed about 25 kilograms, the size of a 6-year-old modern human child. Their brains were astonishingly tiny, barely 400 cubic centimeters, equivalent to the brain size of a modern chimpanzee. However, and this is what is truly fascinating, they manufactured sophisticated stone tools, cooperatively hunted in organized groups, and probably controlled and used fire. When scientists publicly announced their discovery in 2004, many skeptical colleagues initially could not believe that humans so small, with such reduced brains, could have existed so recently in prehistory. Homo floresiensis is a perfect and well-documented example of what evolutionary biologists technically call insular dwarfism, when large animals become geographically isolated on islands with limited food resources and the absence of large predators. Evolution consistently tends to favor progressively smaller bodies that require significantly less daily food to maintain their metabolism. This fascinating phenomenon has occurred repeatedly in different animal species and on different islands around the world, proving to be a predictable evolutionary pattern. In Flores specifically, dwarf elephants also evolved in parallel, reaching barely the modest height of a modern pony. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis, most likely a population of Homo erectus that accidentally reached the island more than 1 million years ago, gradually reduced in size, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years, until reaching their final diminutive size. It is profoundly fascinating to think that these small humans lived at the same time as us, actively hunting in the same tropical jungles where the imposing Komodo dragons now live. At the completely opposite end of the body size spectrum were the Paranthropus, sometimes colloquially called the robust or megadont humans. 3 distinct species of this remarkable genus lived in different regions of Africa between 2.7 million and 1 million years ago. Paranthropus boisei, dramatically discovered by the paleontologist Mary Leakey in the Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, was anatomically particularly impressive. Adult males could weigh up to 50 kilograms and had massive skulls with enormous and prominent sagittal crests, bony structures similar to those of modern gorillas. These pronounced crests served exclusively to anchor incredibly powerful chewing muscles that generated extraordinary bite forces. Their molars were approximately 4 times larger than ours in chewing surface, and the dental enamel was exceptionally thick and resistant. Everything in their cranial and dental anatomy screamed extreme specialization for processing an extraordinarily hard, fibrous, and abrasive diet. Paranthropus lived predominantly in open savanna and scattered forest environments where available plants were frequently hard, leathery, fibrous, and difficult to chew efficiently. They probably spent many hours each day, tirelessly grinding hard underground roots, starch-rich tubers, seeds with tough coats, and extremely fibrous stems. Their massive jaws and chewing muscles could generate bite forces comparable to or superior to those of some much larger modern primates. This extreme morphological specialization made them incredibly efficient and dominant in their particular and specific ecological niche. For more than 1 million consecutive years, they successfully prospered in the constantly changing African landscapes, demonstrating that their evolutionary strategy worked brilliantly. However, their very extreme specialization probably contributed significantly to their inevitable eventual extinction. When climates changed dramatically and available vegetation transformed radically, they simply could not adapt quickly enough to the new conditions. Another species, particularly notable for its extreme physical robustness, was Homo heidelbergensis. This impressive species lived between 600,000 and 200,000 years ago and was found dispersed across both Africa and Europe, and possibly West Asia. Adult individuals were consistently tall, frequently comfortably exceeding 1.8 meters in height, and had extremely muscular and robust constitutions. Their long bones were notably thick, dense, and heavy, suggesting lives characterized by intense and constant physical activity. The skulls featured prominent and protruding brow ridges, and considerably large brains, measuring between 1,100 and 1,300 cubic centimeters in volume. They manufactured sophisticated tools of multiple types, cooperatively hunted large, dangerous mammals, and possibly were the first humans to deliberately construct planned shelters and dwellings. Their notable physical robustness reflected specific evolutionary adaptations for surviving in frequently cold environments and the constant need to hunt large and dangerous prey without the advanced distance weapons that we would develop much later. Homo neanderthalensis, about which we will delve much more extensively in later chapters, also perfectly exemplified extreme physical robustness. Neanderthals had remarkably compact and extraordinarily muscular bodies, perfectly adapted evolutionarily to conserve precious heat in the brutally glacial climates of Europe during the Ice Ages. Their bones were incredibly dense and thick, their joints remarkably large and reinforced, and their muscular insertions were deeply and clearly marked on the bones, unequivocally indicating exceptionally powerful muscles. An average adult Neanderthal was probably significantly stronger, in absolute terms, than a well-trained average modern human. Their noses were distinctly wide and protruding, and their internal nasal cavities large, specific adaptations for efficiently warming and humidifying the freezing air before it reached the sensitive lungs. Every visible aspect of their skeletal anatomy faithfully reflected tens of thousands of years of relentless adaptation to one of the most hostile, challenging, and dangerous environments that humans ever successfully inhabited. At the other anatomical extreme, Homo naledi, dramatically discovered in South Africa in 2013, presents an absolutely baffling mix of archaic, primitive, and advanced modern characteristics in a relatively small and gracile body package. This enigmatic species had surprisingly tiny brains, barely 500 cubic centimeters in volume, sizes similar to those of the Australopithecus, that lived millions of years earlier evolutionarily. However, and this defies expectations, their hands were surprisingly modern, anatomically, perfectly capable of the precise and controlled manipulation necessary to manufacture complex tools. Their feet were virtually structurally identical to ours, perfectly adapted for walking long distances efficiently on varied terrain. The most disturbing and intriguing aspect is that the numerous fossils found in the Rising Star Cave appear to have been deposited there deliberately and repeatedly, provocatively suggesting some kind of complex ritual behavior or intentional disposal of the dead. If this controversial interpretation is truly correct, it would mean that creatures with brains the size of large oranges were participating in symbolic and ritual behaviors that we traditionally consider quintessentially human and dependent on advanced cognition. Overall body size in human species also varied significantly and predictably according to geographic latitude and predominant climate, consistently following a well-established ecological pattern known as Bergmann's rule. This empirical ecological rule states that endothermic, warm-blooded animals evolutionarily tend to have proportionally larger and more robust bodies in colder climates, because larger bodies have a more favorable surface-to-volume ratio for conserving precious metabolic heat. European Neanderthals were generally more robust, compact, and muscular than contemporary African Homo sapiens from the same temporal epoch. This notable morphological difference was not merely cultural or environmental, but fundamentally evolutionary, a direct result of thousands of generations relentlessly adapting to radically different thermal environments. Even within our own species, Homo sapiens, we see notable and predictable body variation. Human populations that evolved near the equator consistently tend to have thinner, taller bodies with long limbs, while populations at high latitudes tend to be more compact, robust, and with relatively short limbs. The diversity in absolute brain size was also considerable and surprising throughout human evolution. Modern human brains average approximately around 1,350 cubic centimeters in volume, but have varied dramatically from less than 400 cubic centimeters in early species to more than 1,700 cubic centimeters in some particularly well-endowed Neanderthal individuals. The fascinating and counterintuitive thing is that absolute brain size alone does not directly determine general intelligence or specific cognitive capacity in a simple way. Homo floresiensis, with its tiny brains comparable to those of chimpanzees, clearly were capable of remarkably complex technological and social behaviors. Neanderthals, with brains frequently larger than ours in absolute volume, were not necessarily more cognitively intelligent than us in all dimensions. What fundamentally matters is not just the total gross size, but the specific internal organization of the brain, which particular areas are disproportionately developed, and how the different neural regions are functionally interconnected. Some evolutionary scientists have convincingly proposed that Homo sapiens finally survived, not because we had the largest brains in absolute volume or the strongest bodies in terms of brute force, but because we had the most versatile and balanced combination of complementary characteristics. We were not extremely specialized for any particular environment or narrow ecological niche. Our bodies were anatomically adaptable and flexible enough to function reasonably well in humid tropical jungles, extreme arid deserts, high-altitude mountains, and eventually even the freezing Arctic. Our intelligence was fundamentally flexible and generalist, rather than rigidly specialized for solving specific problems. We were not objectively the best at anything absolutely specific when compared to specialists, but we were reasonably competent and efficient at practically everything. This adaptive generalization, paradoxically and ironically, turned out to be our greatest unique evolutionary specialization. While other human species adapted increasingly perfectly to particular and narrow ecological niches, we fundamentally adapted to adaptability itself as a strategy. The deep and humbling lesson from these robust giants and diminutive dwarfs of human evolution is clear. We are in no way the inevitable and predestined pinnacle of evolution, the perfect and superior design toward which all nature teleologically tended from the beginning. We are simply one experimental solution, one more among many dozens that blind evolution randomly tested over millions of years. We had the extraordinary luck that our particular, specific combination of anatomical, cognitive, and cultural characteristics turned out to be useful and advantageous in the dramatically changing world of the late Pleistocene. Other human species, equally well or better, perfectly adapted to their specific environmental circumstances, simply did not have that same luck when conditions changed unpredictably. Homo floresiensis was perfectly designed evolutionarily to thrive on its isolated island until ecological conditions changed abruptly and they could no longer adapt. The Paranthropus completely dominated their specialized feeding niche until that niche disappeared climatically and they could not change quickly enough. In the great multiple and continuous experiment of human evolution, there were many successful and viable designs for long periods. We simply were the design that remained successful and viable until the absolute end. Of all the extinct human species that once populated this planet, none captures our collective imagination and fascinates so profoundly as the Neanderthals. For more than a full century, since their initial discovery, they have been systematically portrayed in popular culture as primitive, unsophisticated brutes, stupid and inferior cavemen who justly deserved their inevitable extinction. This persistent and deeply ingrained image in movies, books, and media could not be further from the scientific reality that we have discovered. Neanderthals were genuinely sophisticated humans with complex material cultures, symbolic artistic expressions, elaborate social rituals, and advanced cognitive capacities that directly rivaled ours in many fundamental aspects. Their tragic story is not a simple narrative of biological or cognitive inferiority, but of extraordinary and successful adaptation for hundreds of thousands of years to one of the most challenging, hostile, and dangerous environments that any human species has ever faced and conquered. Deeply understanding who the Neanderthals truly were is absolutely essential to understanding why they finally disappeared and why we, against considerable odds, managed to survive. Neanderthals gradually evolved on the European continent approximately 400,000 years ago, although their direct evolutionary ancestors were clearly present on the continent much earlier, at least 500,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of consecutive years, they meticulously adapted to the dramatically changing and cyclical conditions of the multiple glacial ice ages. Europe during the Middle and Late Pleistocene was not at all the relatively temperate and welcoming continent we know today. It was a place characterized by brutally cold and prolonged winters, short and unpredictable summers, and extremely dangerous megafauna that included cave lions, giant bears, and massive hyenas. Massive glaciers advanced and retreated cyclically every 10 or 20,000 years, radically transforming the landscape, vegetation, and available animal communities. In this extraordinarily hostile and constantly changing environment, Neanderthals not only managed to marginally survive, but they prospered abundantly, developing an impressively sophisticated material culture and extraordinarily effective survival strategies that allowed them to dominate vast territories. Anatomically speaking, Neanderthals were absolutely perfectly designed evolutionarily to withstand and thrive in the extreme cold. Their bodies were remarkably compact, robust, and extraordinarily muscular, with limbs proportionally shorter relative to the torso than typical modern humans. This specific body configuration efficiently minimized the total body surface exposed to the penetrating cold, crucially aiding in conserving valuable internal metabolic heat. Their noses were distinctly wide, protruding forward, and with extraordinarily large and complex internal nasal cavities that efficiently warmed and humidified the freezing air before it reached the sensitive and vulnerable lungs. Their brains were, surprisingly and contrary to popular expectations, on average slightly larger in absolute volume than ours, although anatomically configured remarkably differently in regional proportions. The posterior part of the Neanderthal brain, functionally related to visual spatial processing and precise fine motor control, was particularly and disproportionately developed. This might have provided them with specific cognitive advantages in exceptional hand-eye coordination and three-dimensional spatial perception, crucially necessary for cooperatively hunting in difficult, snowy, and mountainous terrains. The sheer physical strength of Neanderthals was truly legendary in evolutionary terms, and does not constitute any hyperbolic exaggeration. Detailed biomechanical analyses of their fossilized bones consistently reveal muscular insertions deeply and markedly etched into the bone surface, unequivocally indicating extraordinarily powerful and massive muscles. Their long bones were notably dense, thick, and heavy compared to ours, capable of repeatedly supporting and resisting tremendous mechanical forces without fracturing. Rigorous computational biomechanical studies convincingly suggest that an average adult Neanderthal might have been 2 or even 3 times stronger in terms of brute muscle force than a well-trained, average adult modern human. This exceptional strength was not a dispensable biological luxury, but an absolute necessity for their daily survival. They regularly hunted extremely dangerous megafauna, such as massive woolly mammoths, aggressive woolly rhinoceroses, and enormous steppe bison, primarily using heavy thrusting spears at dangerously close range. They did not possess compound bows or spear throwers that allowed attack from the relative safety of distance. Every crucial hunt was a close, direct, and potentially deadly encounter that absolutely required exceptional brute strength, perfect group coordination, and extraordinary personal bravery. The manufactured Neanderthal tools unequivocally demonstrate advanced technical intelligence and sophisticated pre-planning. They systematically manufactured a lithic technology, technically known as the Mousterian industry, distinctively characterized by carefully and meticulously crafted stone tools with multiple specialized functional edges. They deliberately created different morphological types of tools, specifically designed for different complementary functional purposes. Specialized scrapers for processing and tanning animal hides, sharp points for arming effective spears, versatile knives for efficiently cutting meat and tendons. The complete technical manufacturing process required deep and intuitive understanding of the specific physical properties of different types of stone and the cognitive capacity to mentally visualize the final three-dimensional shape before beginning the carving process. Some documented Neanderthal archaeological sites show convincing evidence that they deliberately traveled long distances, sometimes more than 100 kilometers, to specifically obtain superior quality flintstone, unequivocally demonstrating long-term pre-planning and detailed geographical knowledge. They also habitually used sophisticated adhesive glues made from processed birch resin that require carefully heating bark to specific controlled temperatures, a complex and technically demanding chemical process that demonstrates truly advanced technological knowledge. One of the most revolutionary and paradigm-shifting scientific discoveries about Neanderthals is that they indisputably created genuine symbolic art. In multiple carefully dated caves in Spain, unequivocal cave paintings have been found dating back more than 65,000 years, several thousand years, before the first Homo sapiens arrived in Western Europe. These paintings include deliberate, abstract geometric shapes, carefully stenciled handprints, and recognizable representations of contemporary animals. Neanderthals also meticulously perforated decorative seashells and specific animal teeth to create ornamental pendants and personal body jewelry without obvious utilitarian function. They systematically used red ochre mineral, a natural pigment, possibly to decoratively paint their bodies, faces, or clothing, although the exact purpose remains debated. The deliberate creation of symbolic art and personal ornaments was traditionally and firmly considered an exclusive and modern human-defining characteristic, unequivocally associated with advanced abstract symbolic thought. The scientifically established fact that Neanderthals also did this systematically unequivocally means that they were fully capable of truly abstract thought, complex symbolic expression, and probably some form of group cultural identity. Neanderthals also compassionately cared for their chronically ill and severely injured, convincingly demonstrating genuine social cohesion and altruistic compassion toward vulnerable individuals. Multiple individual Neanderthal skeletons have been found that survived for years or even decades with severe traumatic injuries, chronically debilitating diseases, or severe physical disabilities that would have made autonomous self-sufficiency absolutely impossible. A male Neanderthal found in the Shanidar Cave, Iraq, scientifically known as Shanidar I, remarkably survived with a completely useless and atrophied arm, partial or total blindness in one eye, and traumatic cranial injuries that caused severe permanent lameness. He lived to a relatively old age by prehistoric standards. This was only possible because other members of his social group deliberately cared for him, regularly fed him, and actively protected him for many continuous years. This type of prolonged altruistic behavior indisputably requires a developed capacity for emotional empathy, cognitive recognition that other individuals have legitimate needs and mental states, and the social desire to help even when there is no apparent immediate benefit to the helper. There is also convincing and widely accepted archaeological evidence that Neanderthals deliberately and intentionally buried their dead in clearly non-random contexts. Several carefully excavated archaeological sites in Europe and the Middle East contain articulated Neanderthal skeletons in body positions and sedimentary contexts that strongly suggest planned intentional burial. Some buried individuals are accompanied by selected lithic tools, specific animal bones, or other deliberately placed cultural objects. Whether these careful burials included elaborate rituals, articulated beliefs about an afterlife, or primitive religious concepts is fundamentally impossible to determine with absolute certainty, based solely on archaeological evidence. But the simple repeated act of carefully burying the dead strongly suggests cognitive recognition of death as something culturally significant and emotionally important. They did not simply abandon the bodies of deceased companions to decompose or be consumed by scavengers. They treated them with evident care, perhaps genuine respect, possibly profound love. This speaks eloquently of Neanderthals, who were not creatures driven solely by basic instincts of selfish survival, but conscious beings with rich emotional lives, complex social relationships, and possibly abstract conceptions of mortality. Neanderthal language remains a subject of intense and passionate scientific debate, with profound implications. Anatomically speaking, they definitely had the basic physical capacity to produce complex articulated speech. Their hyoid bone, absolutely crucial for fine vocal control, was virtually morphologically identical to ours in all measurable aspects. The base of their skulls shows specific anatomical characteristics clearly associated with sophisticated vocal neurological control. Genetically, they possessed a functional version of the FOXP2 gene, critically important for the neurological development of language, virtually similar to ours, with barely amino acid differences. All of this convincingly suggests that they probably had some genuine form of articulated spoken language, effectively coordinating to cooperatively hunt extremely dangerous animals, systematically manufacturing complex sequences of multifunctional tools, and transmitting accumulated cultural knowledge across multiple successive generations would have been extraordinarily difficult or practically impossible without some system of structured language. The real scientific question is not whether they spoke or not, but how sophisticated, grammatically complex, and semantically rich their language was compared directly to our modern one. Neanderthals also had surprisingly varied, flexible, and adaptively sophisticated diets. For many decades, it was firmly believed that they were exclusively specialized carnivores, hyper-specialized hunters of large mammals, who relied almost entirely on meat. However, modern biochemical analyses of microscopic residues on their fossilized teeth and organic remains at associated archaeological sites reveal a much more complex and nuanced dietary picture. They regularly ate diverse seasonal plants, nutritious nuts, energy-rich seeds, and underground tubers, according to variable seasonal availability. At specific coastal archaeological sites, they habitually consumed diverse shellfish, marine seals, and fish when locally available. Microscopic remains of plants with known medicinal properties have been identified in the calcified dental calculus of some specific individuals, intriguingly suggesting traditional herbal knowledge and possibly deliberate self-medication. They systematically cooked their food using controlled fire, evidence repeatedly found in carbonized organic remains and specific chemical modifications in processed animal bones. Systematic cooking not only makes food significantly easier to mechanically chew and digest, but it allows for the extraction and absorption of more total nutrients, a significant caloric advantage in environments where every individual calorie literally counts for survival. So, if Neanderthals were really so cognitively intelligent, so physically strong, and so adaptively flexible, why exactly did they completely disappear? This fundamental and deeply disconcerting question has obsessively tormented scientists for consecutive decades without a completely satisfactory resolution. There is no single, simple, and completely convincing answer. Neanderthals successfully survived extreme and dramatic climate changes for hundreds of thousands of consecutive years. So, climate change alone does not adequately explain their final extinction. They were consistently successful and effective hunters. So, chronic food shortages also do not seem to be the direct main cause. The arrival of Homo sapiens populations in Europe approximately 45,000 years ago coincides temporally and geographically with the Neanderthal population decline. But the exact nature of our interaction and the specific causal mechanisms remain intensely scientifically controversial. Was there direct economic competition for limited resources, organized territorial violent conflicts, infectious diseases transmitted without immunity, or were we simply marginally more reproductively efficient, gradually outnumbering them over millennia? The most scientifically probable scenario is that multiple independent causal factors worked synergistically together in complex and interactive ways. Neanderthals were never extremely numerous populationally. Their total populations were consistently small and geographically fragmented, living in relatively isolated groups dispersed across vast mountainous territories. This made them demographically vulnerable to random population fluctuations, genetic inbreeding, and bottleneck effects. When large populations of Homo sapiens arrived and expanded, there was probably not an organized and deliberate genocidal war, but gradual, persistent, and cumulative competition. Perhaps we were marginally more efficient in specific hunting techniques or foraging strategies. Perhaps our social networks were significantly larger and more extensive, allowing for faster exchange of useful information and improved technology. Perhaps we consistently had more children who successfully survived to reproductive adulthood. Small but consistent demographic advantages, mathematically compounded over thousands of years, can inexorably lead to one population gradually and completely replacing another, without any individual involved even consciously realizing that a progressive extinction is occurring. The last documented known Neanderthals lived in Gibraltar approximately 40,000 years ago, final refugees on a rocky peninsula at the extreme edge of Western Europe. By that final historical moment, Homo sapiens had successfully occupied and colonized most of their former European territory. The last surviving Neanderthal groups lived in a world that was becoming progressively alien, geographically surrounded by a radically different human species that spoke mutually incomprehensible languages and had strange cultural customs. Eventually, and inevitably, those last isolated groups also silently disappeared, and with them, an ancient evolutionary line that had successfully existed for 400,000 consecutive years permanently went extinct. But in a deep genetic sense, they did not absolutely or completely disappear. Significant parts of them continue to live biologically within us, preserved in the fragments of Neanderthal DNA that we still carry in our genomes, permanent genetic reminders that we were once not completely alone on this planet. If Neanderthals are indisputably the famous and widely known cousins of our complex evolutionary family, the Denisovans are definitely the mysterious and enigmatic cousins that we are just beginning to superficially know. For practically the entire documented history of humanity, we did not even know they had ever existed. They do not appear in any ancient historical record, traditional legend, or cultural myth of any known civilization. Their surprising scientific discovery in 2010 completely revolutionized our fundamental understanding of prehistoric human diversity and dramatically demonstrated that the evolutionary past held extraordinary surprises that we had not even remotely imagined possible. Denisovans lived extensively in vast regions of Asia for tens of thousands of consecutive years. They genetically interbred with our direct ancestors on multiple occasions and left a significant genetic legacy that still directly affects millions of people today. However, almost absolutely everything we scientifically know about them comes from a few tiny fragments of bones found in a single remote and isolated cave. The Denisova Cave is geographically located in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, near where the modern borders of Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan converge in an extremely remote region. It is a remarkably cold, isolated, and difficult to access place, but archaeologically extraordinarily rich in prehistoric materials. For consecutive decades, Russian archaeologists systematically excavated the cave, repeatedly finding varied stone tools and bones of extinct animals that clearly indicated prolonged ancient human occupation. In 2008, they found a small finger bone fragment, phalanx, of a child in stratigraphic sedimentary layers that geologically dated back approximately 50,000 years. The bone fragment looked morphologically human, so initially, researchers reasonably assumed it belonged to a modern Homo sapiens, or perhaps a known Neanderthal. When they finally carefully extracted and completely sequenced the preserved ancient DNA, they discovered something completely unexpected and revolutionary. The genomic DNA did not significantly match current modern humans or known Neanderthals. It unequivocally belonged to a human species completely unknown to modern science. The Denisovans, conventionally named after the specific cave where they were initially discovered, represent one of the most enigmatic, mysterious, and poorly understood branches of the complex human evolutionary tree. Genetically speaking, they were evolutionary sister species to the European Neanderthals, sharing a relatively recent common ancestor. Both human groups evolved from a common ancestral population that successfully left Africa more than 500,000 years ago, while some descendants of these migrant ancestors gradually headed toward Western Europe and eventually became the classic Neanderthals. Other groups consistently headed toward East Asia, progressively dispersing across the vast Asian continent. Over considerable evolutionary time, the East Asian populations gradually evolved into the distinctive Denisovans, specifically adapting to the diverse and varied environments of the largest, most populated, and geographically complex continent on Earth. For hundreds of thousands of consecutive years, Western Neanderthals and Eastern Denisovans evolved completely independently, in geographical isolation, developing distinctive anatomical and genetic characteristics specifically adapted to their respective climatologically different territories. What is scientifically frustrating and simultaneously fascinating about the Denisovans is how extremely little physical fossil material we currently have of them. Until the present moment, the only unequivocally confirmed remains consist of that original tiny finger fragment, some isolated molar teeth, small fragments of a partial skull, and, surprisingly, an almost complete jawbone. A robust Denisovan jawbone was recently definitively identified in a high-altitude Tibetan cave, constituting the first Denisovan fossil found outside the original Siberian Denisova cave. These extremely limited physical remains make it extraordinarily difficult, or practically impossible, to confidently reconstruct their complete physical appearance and total body anatomy. The molar teeth are notably large in absolute size, significantly larger than those of Neanderthals or modern humans, with archaic morphological characteristics that are reminiscent of much older evolutionary species. The limited cranial fragments tentatively suggest relatively wide and robust skulls, but without reasonably complete skeletons or multiple well-preserved individuals, much of their complete skeletal anatomy remains a fundamental and frustrating scientific mystery. However, what we critically lack in tangible physical fossils, we partially but significantly compensate for with advanced molecular genetics. The ancient DNA, carefully extracted from the scarce Denisovan remains, has been sequenced with exceptional technical quality and notable genomic coverage, providing invaluable detailed information about their specific biology and historical evolution. We definitely know that they had considerable and significant internal genetic variation, clearly indicating broad, numerous, and geographically dispersed populations. Sophisticated computational genomic analyses of the DNA convincingly suggest that there were at least 3 distinct Denisovan population groups in different geographical regions of Asia, possibly genetically differentiated enough to be considered reproductively isolated subpopulations or even separate biological species. Some groups lived in cold southern Siberia, others in tropical Southeast Asia, and others in the extreme high-altitude Tibetan plateaus. Each population group was probably specifically evolutionarily adapted to particular environmental, climatic, and ecological conditions. One of the most scientifically fascinating and medically relevant Denisovan adaptations directly involves sustained life at extreme high altitudes. Current modern human Tibetan populations carry a specific and distinctive genetic variant that physiologically helps them efficiently survive in mountain environments where atmospheric oxygen is severely scarce. This particular variant of the $EPAS, $1 gene, critically regulates red blood cell production and allows metabolic function to be efficient with significantly less available oxygen. Genetic scientists surprisingly discovered that this adaptive variant did not evolve independently in modern Tibetan humans. It was directly inherited from the Denisovans several thousand years ago, when our Homo sapiens ancestors reproductively interbred with them on the Tibetan plateau. The Denisovans, who lived stably on the high plateaus of Central Asia, had evolutionarily developed this crucial physiological adaptation during tens of thousands of years of natural selection, and when they genetically mated with migrant Homo sapiens, they transmitted this valuable adaptive trait to us. It is a perfect and well-documented example of how occasional interbreeding between distinct species can instantly transfer extremely useful adaptations that would have taken thousands of generations to evolve independently. The global geographical distribution of Denisovan DNA in current modern human populations reveals intriguing, complex, and informative patterns. The highest levels of Denisovan ancestry are consistently found in indigenous peoples of New Guinea, Melanesia, and Australia, where some individual people carry up to 5% of total Denisovan DNA in their genomes. Southeast Asian continental populations have significant intermediate levels of Denisovan ancestry. East Asians and Native Americans have smaller but detectable amounts of Denisovan DNA. Modern Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans have virtually no significantly detectable Denisovan ancestry. These clear geographical patterns convincingly suggest that reproductive interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Denisovans occurred primarily when our ancestors were actively migrating across Asia toward Oceania, approximately 50,000 years ago. Multiple distinct interbreeding events probably occurred in different geographical locations and temporal moments with different genetically differentiated Denisovan population groups. The Denisovan DNA that modern humans carry is not functionally neutral or genetically irrelevant. Some specific inherited genes provide clear and measurable adaptive advantages, while others may increase susceptibility to certain specific modern diseases. In addition to the crucial physiological adaptation to extreme altitude, Denisovan genes significantly influence immunological function in some current Asian populations. Inherited genetic variants directly affect how our immune systems specifically respond to pathogenic viruses and bacteria. This makes perfect evolutionary and adaptive sense. The Denisovans had lived established in Asia for hundreds of thousands of consecutive years, gradually adapting to specific local pathogens. When our Homo sapiens ancestors arrived relatively recently from Africa, they completely lacked immunological resistance to these local Asian pathogens. Reproductively interbreeding with local Denisovans and inheriting their immunological genes provided instant and effective protection, dramatically accelerating our collective capacity to successfully colonize new, previously uninhabited territories. The Denisova cave itself provides extraordinary and virtually unique archaeological evidence of direct interactions between multiple distinct human species. Detailed stratigraphic analyses of successive sedimentary layers convincingly show that the cave was intermittently occupied for more than 300,000 consecutive years by different human species during distinct periods. Characteristic Mousterian lithic tools strongly suggest temporary Neanderthal presence. Other different technological artifacts indicate prolonged Denisovan occupation. More recent upper sedimentary layers contain tools clearly associated with modern Homo sapiens. The most absolutely astonishing and paradigm-shifting discovery is a bone fragment unequivocally belonging to a hybrid individual whose mother was genetically Neanderthal and father genetically Denisovan. This first-generation hybrid definitively demonstrates that these distinct species not only coexisted geographically, but reproductively mated and produced viable and fertile offspring. The hybrid girl lived approximately 90,000 years ago, constituting direct and irrefutable physical evidence that the biological borders between distinct human species were reproductively porous and permeable. The lithic tools and cultural artifacts stratigraphically associated with Denisovans suggest genuinely sophisticated technological and cognitive capabilities. In the Denisova cave layers, an ornamental bracelet made of polished green chlorite stone was found, elaborately manufactured with specialized techniques that require specific tools and considerable developed artisanal skill. Fine needles made of polished bone indicate systematic manufacture of complexly sewn clothing, absolutely necessary for surviving in the extreme Siberian cold. Some stratigraphic levels contain perforated ornamental beads and decorated objects without obvious utilitarian function. Whether these sophisticated cultural artifacts were originally created by Denisovans, Neanderthals, visiting, or early Homo sapiens, is difficult to determine with absolute certainty, as the three distinct human species occupied the cave at different, partially overlapping temporal moments. But the presence of advanced technology in layers clearly associated with Denisovans strongly suggests that they were not cognitively inferior to other contemporary human species. The total Denisovan geographical range was probably extraordinarily vast and extensive. Although we have only found confirmed physical fossils in two limited geographical locations. Their persistent DNA, in modern populations, from cold Siberia to tropical Australia, convincingly suggests that they populated much of East and South Asia. They likely inhabited temperate forests, dry steppes, high-altitude mountains, and possibly even accessible Southeast Asian islands. Different separated Denisovan populations would have inevitably developed specific local adaptations to climates that varied dramatically from extreme cold to hot, humid tropics. This notable adaptive flexibility is truly extraordinary and convincingly suggests that, just like Homo sapiens, Denisovans were evolutionary generalists capable of thriving in extremely diverse environments. They were not restrictively confined to a narrow, specialized ecological niche like some more morphologically specialized human species. The final extinction of the Denisovans probably occurred between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago, approximately, although determining absolutely precise dates is extremely difficult with so few directly datable fossils. Their population disappearance approximately coincides temporally and geographically with the demographic expansion of Homo sapiens across East and South Asia. The probable causes were similar to those that fatally affected the probable causes: European Neanderthals, economic competition for limited resources, small and geographically fragmented populations, possible transmission of infectious diseases, and gradual genetic absorption through continuous reproductive interbreeding. It is perfectly possible that the last Denisovans did not abruptly go extinct in a catastrophic event, but gradually and imperceptibly intermingled with Homo sapiens populations until they ceased to exist as a genetically distinct and identifiable group. In a certain deep sense, they were genetically assimilated rather than violently annihilated. What makes the Denisovans particularly scientifically intriguing is how extraordinarily much we still do not definitively know. Every year brings new genetic discoveries that expand and complicate our evolutionary understanding. Recent genetic analyses suggest that there were more Denisovan population groups than we initially thought, possibly dispersed from Siberia to insular Southeast Asia. Some scientists provocatively speculate that archaic human populations described in ancient historical chronicles of Asia might have been late surviving Denisovans. Although there is no solid archaeological evidence for this currently, the active search for more Denisovan fossils continues intensely in caves and archaeological sites across East Asia. Every new tiny bone fragment, every sample of ancient DNA laboriously extracted from stratigraphic sediments brings us incrementally a little closer to understanding who these mysterious and enigmatic humans really were, who shared the planet with our direct ancestors and contributed significantly genetically to making us who we are today. While Neanderthals dominated Europe and Denisovans roamed Asia, there existed a human species that represents perhaps the greatest evolutionary success ever recorded in our lineage: Homo erectus. Homo erectus not only survived, but thrived for almost 2 million consecutive years, an absolutely astonishing record that no other human species has remotely equaled. To put this into humbling perspective, our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed for barely about 300,000 years, a minuscule fraction compared to the extraordinary longevity of Homo erectus. This species was truly the tireless traveler of prehistory, the first hominin to successfully leave Africa and colonize vast territories across 3 different continents. Its history is one of exceptional adaptability, constant technological innovation, and an extraordinary capacity to survive in radically diverse environments, ranging from tropical jungles to cold steppes. Homo erectus first appeared in the African fossil record approximately 1.9 million years ago. Although some scientists argue that early forms might have existed 2 million years ago, it represented a dramatic evolutionary shift from earlier, more primitive species. They were significantly taller than their predecessors, with adult individuals frequently reaching between 1.6 and 1.8 meters in height, comparable to modern humans. Their bodies were notably slender and elongated, with long legs perfectly adapted for efficiently walking and running long distances in warm, open environments. This specific body anatomy strongly suggests adaptation for life on the African savannas, where the ability to cover great distances was crucial for finding scattered food and water. Their brains were substantially larger than those of Homo habilis, measuring between 800 and 1,000 cubic centimeters, although still significantly smaller than ours. This notable cerebral increase would have allowed for greater cognitive complexity, better long-term planning, and more sophisticated social capacities. The lithic technology of Homo erectus marked a revolutionary advance in human tool manufacturing. They developed what archaeologists call the Acheulean industry, characterized by carefully crafted and symmetrical bifacial hand axes. These tools were dramatically more sophisticated than the simple Oldowan tools of earlier species. Creating an Acheulean hand axe required hundreds of precise and controlled blows, systematically removing flakes from both sides of a stone core to create a symmetrical final shape with sharp functional edges. This deliberate symmetry is not merely aesthetic, but reflects advanced mental planning and three-dimensional understanding. Hand axes were used for multiple purposes: cutting meat, processing hides, working wood, and possibly digging up roots. What is remarkable is that this specific technology remained virtually unchanged for more than 1 million years, suggesting a stable cultural tradition faithfully transmitted across countless generations. One of the most significant achievements of Homo erectus was the systematic control of fire. Archaeological evidence from sites in Africa and Asia suggests that they controlled fire at least 1 million years ago and possibly much earlier. Fire fundamentally transformed human existence in ways we can barely fully appreciate today. It provided vital warmth on freezing cold nights, protection against dangerous nocturnal predators, and light that extended the useful hours of the day. It allowed for cooking food, making tough vegetables more digestible, killing dangerous parasites in meat, and releasing more nutrients and calories from foods that would be difficult to process raw. Some scientists argue that systematic cooking allowed for the development of larger brains, because cooked foods require less energy to digest, freeing up metabolic resources to maintain energy-hungry brain tissue. Fire would also have had profound social significance, creating natural focal points around which communities gathered, shared food, and possibly told stories. But perhaps the most impressive achievement of Homo erectus was its unprecedented geographical expansion. Approximately 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus populations began to leave Africa, becoming the first hominins to successfully colonize other continents. Unequivocal Homo erectus fossils have been found in Georgia, dated 1.8 million years ago, demonstrating that they reached the Caucasus extraordinarily early. In China, sites like Zhoukoudian contain remains of Homo erectus that lived 500,000 years ago, popularly known as Peking man. In Indonesia, Java man represents Homo erectus populations that colonized Southeast Asian islands more than 1 million years ago. These massive migrations were not single events, but gradual processes that occurred over hundreds of thousands of years, with populations slowly expanding into new territories generation after generation. The exact migratory routes and specific motivations remain scientifically debated. Some researchers suggest that they followed migratory herds of herbivores, their main food source, Others propose that periodic climate changes would have created geographical corridors that facilitated movement to new regions. Probably, multiple factors interacted: population pressure in Africa, natural curiosity, pursuit of prey animals, and opportunities created by climatic fluctuations. What is notable is that they successfully managed to adapt to environments radically different from the African savannas where they originally evolved. In China, they faced unprecedented cold winters in their African evolutionary experience. On Southeast Asian islands, they navigated completely different dense tropical jungles. This exceptional adaptive flexibility clearly distinguishes them from earlier hominids geographically confined to Africa. The anatomical diversity within Homo erectus was considerable, reflecting adaptations to diverse local environments. Asian populations tended to be more robust, with distinctive cranial characteristics. African populations showed slightly different characteristics. Some scientists argue that what we call Homo erectus was actually multiple related species that should be classified separately. This taxonomic controversy reflects the fundamental difficulty of defining species boundaries in the fossil record when there is substantial geographical variation. Regardless of precise classifications, it is clear that these populations were evolutionarily related and shared fundamental characteristics that distinguish them from other human species. The hunting strategies of Homo erectus were probably sophisticated, cooperative. Archaeological sites contain bones of large animals, including ancient elephants, with cut marks that demonstrate systematic processing. Hunting megafauna of this size absolutely requires group coordination, effective communication, and strategic planning. They likely use techniques such as corralling animals towards swamps or cliffs, where they became vulnerable. Wooden spears found at European sites dating back 300,000 years, probably associated with descendants of Homo erectus, demonstrate the capacity to manufacture effective hunting weapons. Cooperative hunting would have required considerable cognitive and social capacities, reinforcing group bonds and facilitating knowledge exchange. The social structure of Homo erectus remains speculative, but was likely complex. The considerable brain size suggests cognitive capacities that would allow for sophisticated social relationships. The dependence on cooperative hunting would have favored cohesive groups with differentiated roles. The care of the injured and elderly, suggested by some fossils that show individuals who survived severe injuries, indicates empathy and social support. They likely lived in groups of moderate size, perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, large enough for effective hunting, but not so large that resources were quickly depleted. The cultural transmission of lithic technology for more than 1 million years demonstrates the capacity for social learning, intergenerational teaching. Language in Homo erectus is a topic of intense debate without a definitive resolution. Anatomically, their spinal nerve canals were narrower than ours, possibly suggesting less respiratory control necessary for complex articulated speech. However, the coordination required for cooperative hunting, manufacturing complex tools, and cultural transmission suggests some system of communication more sophisticated than primate calls. It is possible that they had proto-language, something intermediate between animal communication and completely grammatical modern human language. They might have used limited vocabulary, combined with gestures, facial expressions, and situational context to communicate necessary information. This capacity would have been sufficient for the needs of their lifestyle, but less elaborate than the complex symbolic language that characterizes modern humans. The eventual extinction of Homo erectus occurred approximately 50,000 years ago, when the last populations in Java finally disappeared. For almost 2 million years, they had dominated, survived countless climate changes, colonized 3 continents, and demonstrated exceptional adaptability. Their disappearance approximately coincides temporally with the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa. It is likely that competition with our species contributed to their final decline. We were probably more efficient at obtaining resources, had more advanced technology, and possibly greater cognitive flexibility. It is also possible that Homo erectus populations hybridized with Homo sapiens or other species, being gradually genetically absorbed. Recent genetic evidence suggests that modern humans in Asia carry fragments of DNA from unknown archaic species, possibly late Homo erectus. The legacy of Homo erectus is profound and undeniable. They were pioneers who opened the world to human colonization. They demonstrated that humans could adapt to virtually any terrestrial environment. They developed technologies that remained useful for more than 1 million years. They established the foundation for all subsequent human species that evolved in Asia and Europe. Without their extraordinary success and notable longevity, our own species probably never would have existed. We are, in a very real sense, the heirs of Homo erectus, beneficiaries of their adaptability, their innovation, and their tirelessly traveling spirit that took them to every corner of the ancient world. The extinction of 20 human species did not occur in a single catastrophic event, nor did it follow a single predictable pattern. Each species disappeared at its own historical moment, under its own particular circumstances, and due to unique combinations of environmental, biological, and possibly cultural factors. However, when chronologically examining the last species to vanish from the planet, revealing patterns emerge that help us understand why we survived, while all our evolutionary cousins perished. This chronology of final disappearances tells a story of both environmental change and direct competition between different forms of humanity. Homo floresiensis, the small humans of the island of Flores, are among the species that survived until surprisingly recent dates. Archaeological evidence suggests that they existed until approximately 50,000 years ago, which means they temporarily coexisted with modern humans who were already migrating across Southeast Asia. Their relatively sudden disappearance in the fossil record approximately coincides with evidence of significant volcanic activity on Flores. A massive volcanic eruption about 50,000 years ago would have dramatically transformed the insular ecosystem, destroying forests, contaminating water sources, and eliminating crucial prey animals. For a small, isolated population on a resource-limited island, such an environmental catastrophe would have been devastating and impossible to survive. However, some scientists also speculate that the arrival of Homo sapiens in the region might have indirectly contributed to their extinction, perhaps by competing for limited resources or introducing new diseases against which they had no defenses. Neanderthals persisted in Europe until approximately 40,000 years ago, making them one of the last non-sapien species to go extinct. Their disappearance was gradual and geographically irregular, beginning in the east of their range and progressing toward the west over several thousand years. The last known Neanderthal refuges were on the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Gibraltar, where archaeological sites contain evidence of Neanderthal occupation until approximately 39,000 years ago. This progressive territorial contraction suggests increasing population pressure, likely related to both climate changes and the expansion of Homo sapiens. During this final period, Neanderthal populations were small, fragmented, and genetically isolated, making them vulnerable to genetic bottleneck effects and random demographic fluctuations. Climate change during this period was particularly volatile, with temperatures fluctuating dramatically and ecosystems rapidly transforming. Neanderthals, specifically adapted to glacial conditions, might have faced increasing difficulties when climates became more variable and unpredictable. The relationship between the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe and the Neanderthal extinction has been intensely debated for decades. Initially, some scientists proposed scenarios of direct violent conflict with modern humans, actively exterminating Neanderthals in something akin to prehistoric genocide. However, archaeological evidence of direct violence between species is practically non-existent. More recent models suggest subtler but equally effective economic competition. Homo sapiens had slightly more efficient technologies, particularly projectile weapons like spear throwers and eventually bows, that allowed hunting from safer distances. Our social networks were apparently more extensive, facilitating the exchange of information and technology among dispersed groups. These small but cumulative advantages would have allowed Homo sapiens populations to exploit resources more efficiently, gradually outnumbering Neanderthals over thousands of years. Additionally, genetic evidence of hybridization suggests that part of the Neanderthal population was genetically absorbed, rather than simply going extinct, with Neanderthal genes persisting in hybrid descendants. Denisovans disappeared in approximately the same temporal period as Neanderthals, between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. Although precise dates are difficult to establish with so few datable fossils, their extinction probably followed patterns similar to the Neanderthal one: small and dispersed populations facing climate changes while simultaneously competing with expansive Homo sapiens. Genetic evidence shows that there was significant hybridization between Denisovans and modern humans, particularly in populations migrating toward Oceania. It is possible that in some regions, Denisovan populations were gradually absorbed through repeated interbreeding until they ceased to exist as genetically distinct entities. In other areas, they might have simply been numerically overwhelmed and excluded from optimal territories. The mountainous topography of Central Asia, where Denisovans were probably most common, would have created naturally fragmented populations in isolated valleys, making them particularly vulnerable to local extinction that eventually became total extinction. Homo erectus, despite its extraordinary success for almost 2 million years, finally went extinct approximately 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. The last known populations survived in Java, Indonesia, apparently refugees on this island, while Homo sapiens progressively colonized the Asian continent. Their final disappearance temporally coincides with the arrival of modern humans in the Southeast Asian region, after surviving countless climate changes, ice ages, and ecological transformations during its long existence. Homo erectus finally encountered competition that it could not overcome. It is profoundly ironic and somewhat sad that such a successful and long-lasting species disappeared precisely when our species began its global expansion. The lesson is clear: past evolutionary longevity does not guarantee future survival when conditions fundamentally change. Other less-known species also disappeared during this critical period of the late Pleistocene.